I'm Joan McGregor. I'm the director of the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics and also a professor of philosophy in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. And this event is being sponsored by us and also ASU Farm. And we have my colleague here, Tyler DeRoche, who's the director of that initiative. And so, we're, I guess, and also Bio and Society, sorry. Bio and Society is also a sponsor of this event as well. So again, welcome for coming today. So we've got a special guest here today, Roberta Millstein, distinguished philosopher of science whose work bridges disciplines in environmental ethics, ecology, and history and philosophy of biology. She's emerita at University of California, Davis, my old alma mater from so many years ago. I think everybody's dead that I knew there, but that's okay. But her scholarship is focused on the philosophical foundations of ecology and evolution. She's widely recognized for insightful analyses of scientific concepts such as natural selection, population, and interdependence. But she's here to talk today to us about Aldo Leopold, and I think we've got some Aldo Leopold fans in the audience. So, and sort of like rich connections with Leopold. So I'm hoping we're going to have some really good discussions here today. Because she's got a new book out called "The Land is Our Community: Aldo Leopold's Environmental Ethics for the New Millennium," published by University of Chicago Press. And so really interested to hear her interpretation of the land ethic. As I say, many of us have read this work and worked on it in different dimensions. So we're really excited to hear what she's got to say today. So we've got people online and we've got people in the audience. So we're gonna have lots of time for Q&A at the end, and then we have a reception afterwards. So join me in welcoming Roberta Millstein. Thank you. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So thank you, Professor McGregor, and thank you to the Lincoln Center and Biology and Society and ASU Farm. Thank you all for having me out here. I'm really excited to talk to you all about one of my favorite subjects, Aldo Leopold. So Professor DeRoche suggested that I talk about stewardship, and I don't know if that was just kind of an offhand remark or a serious one, but I took it seriously. I thought, what happens if I think about Leopold in terms of stewardship? Because it wasn't something I actually talked about in the book. So this is a bit of me looking at the topics of my book, but from a slightly different direction. So did Aldo Leopold's land ethic endorse stewardship of the land? So at first glance, you might say, oh yeah, of course he did, right? A land ethic reflects the existence of an ecological conscience, and this in turn reflects a conviction of individual responsibility for the health of the land, right? Sounds like stewardship. Health is the capacity of the land for self-renewal. Conservation is our effort to understand and preserve this capacity. But is this really stewardship? What is stewardship? It turns out there are a lot of definitions of stewardship, too many to survey here. One example, many versions have the roots in the Bible's book of Genesis, and that grants humans dominion. I'll come back to that later. Dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the earth and everything living upon the earth. Now, as I said before, I don't think Leopold uses that word stewardship specifically to describe his land ethics, so that sort of leaves the question open. What would it mean to understand Leopold's views in terms of stewardship? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And as I said before, I'm going to draw heavily on my book, but I'm not going to, kind of follow the structure of the book. I'm going to take a different structure. So just for those of you who haven't read it, it is a new interpretation of Leopold's land ethic and also a new defense. I take this approach, kind of an interdisciplinary approach from history and philosophy of science as well as environmental ethics. Kind of the major themes of the book, part of it is conceptual. So I identify interdependence, land community, and land health as central concepts in the land ethic, and I talk about each of those is actually a chapter in the book. Then I give some reasons why we should accept Leopold's views, why I think he thought we should accept his views. And then in the last chapter, talk about how land ethic, really actually the whole book, why it's still relevant to contemporary ecology and conservation biology, including policy. So that's just a quick overview. But like I said, I'm going to be doing a slightly different structure today. So I'll start with a very brief background on Aldo Leopold, for those of you who don't know who he is. Then I'm going to talk about Gifford Pinchot's understanding of stewardship, and I'll say why I picked him and contrast that with Leopold. Then I'm going to elaborate what I'm calling 5 precepts of Leopoldian stewardships, but really it's not so much an elaboration as this is actually my exploration, right? I'm exploring what it might be like to think about Leopold in terms of stewardship. Then I'll give some further reflections on what that means and then some final thoughts. All right, so brief background on Aldo Leopold. He wore a lot of hats during his lifetime. So he was a hunter, a forester, a wildlife manager, an ecologist, a conservationist, and a professor, and that's not even all the hats. But all those hats affected the ideas that he came up with, and he learned in each case. And he's one of these people whose views very much changed over the course of his lifetime. So all of his experiences informed the ideas he came to by the end of his life. And so he's known for the work he did at the end of his life, and that's Sand County Almanac. That's what he's most known for. And among philosophers, which I am one, he's especially known for the essay, The Land Ethic, which is in Sand County Almanac. But I always like to highlight that he did a lot of other work for a lot of different audiences, right? Scientific audiences, policy audiences, public audiences. And so if you want to understand Leopold, really understand him, you have to go into some of these other works. And the Aldo Leopold Foundation has a wonderful website that lets you do all that. But then finally, I just always like to emphasize how influential Leopold's thinking has been. I came to him from environmental ethics, where he is, his work is standard in all the textbooks, but he's also been very influential in fields like forestry or restoration ecology or wildlife management, right? Some of the fields that he himself worked in, right? His influence has continued. So if you're thinking, well, why Leopold? Why talk about him? It's because of his ongoing influence. Okay. So as I promised, I would start out with Gifford Pinchot's conception of stewardship. So when Leopold started at Yale's Forest School, this is right at the beginning of his career, started at Yale's Forest School in 1905. He was given this use book, and the use book gave regulations and instructions for the use of the National Forest Reserves. And in this use book, right at the beginning, there's a letter from Pinchot, and he was then chief of the newly formed National Forest Service. And that letter served as a basis for the policy outlined in the whole book, right? So this kind of outlines basically the philosophy of, how we were supposed to use the forest. Now, this letter doesn't use the word stewardship either, but it's been widely understood as expressing a form of stewardship. In the administration of the forest reserves, and this is, sorry, I'm quoting from the letter now. In the administration of the forest reserves, it must be clearly borne in mind that all land is to be devoted to its most productive use for the permanent good of the whole people and not for the temporary benefit of individuals or companies. All the resources of the forest reserves are for use. And that use is emphasized in the original. And the letter continues. You will see to it that the water, wood, and forage of the reserves are conserved and wisely used for the benefit of the home builder, first of all, upon whom depends the best permanent use of lands and resources alike. The continued prosperity of the agricultural, lumbering, mining, and livestock interests is directly dependent on a permanent and accessible supply of water, wood, and forage, as well as upon the present and future use of these resources under business-like regulation, where conflicting interests, right, you will get conflicting interests, where they must be reconciled, the question will always be decided from the standpoint of the greatest good of the greatest number in the long run. Okay, that was a lot of quote. What I've done now is things that philosophers do, break sort of what I take to be the main ideas into sort of 5 precepts. One is that Pinchot sees the forest and its inhabitants as resources, right? He uses that word. Second is that productive use of the forest is for humans alone. So this is an anthropocentric kind of stewardship, for humans alone. That third precept is that resources should be deployed for their best use in the present in such a way that they can continue to be available for the best use in the future. And that's the phrase he's often quoted, they must be conserved and used wisely. The fourth precept that I identify is that economic aspects are the primary, if not the sole, consideration of this vision of stewardship. And finally, that conflicts are to be resolved by a long-run anthropocentric utilitarian calculus. For those of us who are not philosophers, that's that the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. Okay, so Leopold takes his first job after his time at Yale, and he gets a job as forest assistant at the Apache National Forest here in Arizona. And in the beginning, I think he accepted, this is what he was told to do. I think he accepted this view of stewardship. But by the end of his life, he had come to some different views. Some of the things he retained, I'll talk about that, but I think he'd come to some different views. So I'm now leaping to the end of his career. First, and again, this is me identifying what I see as stewardship precepts for Leopold. One is that we should see the forest and its inhabitants, and these he identifies as plants, animals, soils, and waters. We should see the forest and its inhabitants as fellow community members, not as resources. Second, and these are meant to contrast with each of the Pinchot ones, actions should not benefit only humans alone, but also community members and the community as a whole, right? The individual members and the community as a whole. Actions should seek to protect and promote the long-term health of the land community. Fourth, he tells us to quit thinking about decent land use solely as an economic problem, that we need to also consider what is ethically and aesthetically right. And finally, fifth precept, that when we do have to resolve conflicts, which again we will, he says, or I identify as a precept the idea that we should do this through a process that incorporates multiple values and interests, working to harmonize them to the extent possible with a common commitment to the health of the land. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is go through each of these one at a time and kind of elaborate on them. And really talk about why Leopold thought we should accept them, or why we should accept them. Now, caveat, I do want to say this is not meant to be a complete history of how Leopold came to change his mind on these views. In some cases, I'll be addressing these really more philosophically, in other cases more historically. So it's sort of a tack from a historically informed philosopher, which is more or less what I take myself to be. Okay, so again, going through each of the 5 precepts, our question that the first precept raises is, why is the land community our community, right? That's how I title my book, The Land is Our Community. Why is the land community our community? So here Leopold said, all ethics so far evolved rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. And I'll come back to that premise later. So what's the land ethic doing? It's simply enlarging the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. And Leopold thought that both ecology and history teach us that it's not just humans we're interdependent with. So let's take a moment to look at that. So looking at this from the lens of ecology, here Leopold referred to entangled lines of dependency. So he talked about things like predator-prey relations, or exploitation of one species by another, or services provided from one species to another, or even parasite-host interactions, right? All these types of interactions are the basis for these, what he called entangled lines of interdependency. That's It's a little fuzzy, that diagram, but that's what he's depicting in that diagram. So some of his examples of lines of interdependency. One is a food chain. That's, simple, most basic. A squirrel drops an acorn, that feeds a quail, that feeds a horned owl, and that feeds a parasite, right? Simple chain of one thing eating another thing. But again, lines of dependency aren't just food chains. This is meant to be a broader term than that. So the oak grows fuel, browse, hollow dens, leaves, and shade on which many species depend for food and cover or other services, right? So other services are also considered interdependent. Importantly, humans and our domestic species are part of these chains of interdependency. So again, I don't know how well you could see that diagram, but down the middle, you've got student, lawyer, grocer, farmer, cow, alfalfa, soil, and rock. And that line right down the middle gives you, domestic animals, as well as soil and rock, as well as humans, right? So all of those are, when you think of interdependence, think of all of the different entities of the land community. And as I said just a moment ago, including the abiotic components like soil, which are also seen to be entangled with the other components. Okay. I always like to think about bees, just to further elaborate when what I think Leopold meant by interdependence. Why? Because a huge percentage of our crops and our native flowers depend on various bee species for pollination, and in turn, human and non-human animals are depending on those for food. Unfortunately, there are many threats to bees today, many of them, most of them probably from us. So they include human-caused global climate change, as well as pesticide use. So these are negative or harmful interactions with bees. But those negative interactions with bees, those make bees dependent on us, right? That's a kind of interdependence. They are dependent on us for what we do or what we fail to do. They are vulnerable, right? And that's part of interdependence as well, that vulnerability. Now, of course, it's also open to us to interact with bees in beneficial ways, positive ways. Now, either way, whether we interact with bees in positive ways or negative ways, those interactions are going to affect other species as well, right? That's what interdependence is about. So it's going to, again, affect flowers, crops, soil, and water, and all the species that depend on them, right? All down the chain. So, but it's really not just one chain. It's really, as that previous diagram showed, right? It's really entangled bunch of chains. And that is a web of interdependence. And that is what a land community is. It's really these webs of interdependence. Okay, so that was what interdependence looks like, looking at the lens of ecology. Now let's turn to history. So here, Leopold said that many historical events, hitherto explained solely in terms of human enterprise, were actually biotic interactions between people and the land, and that the characteristics of the land determined the facts quite as potently as the characteristics of the people who lived on it. And so in this context, he asked, well, what if when Kentucky was subject to colonization by white settlers, what if plow, fire, and axe had yielded not bluegrass, but some worthless sedge, shrub, or weed, right? What if, the bluegrass was valuable to the settlers, but what if something had grown up that wasn't useful to them? And then he says, American history might have been very different just because of the way the land was. And yet we often don't think about that, right? We just think about what the people did. We don't think about what the land did and how that affected history. So, in short, interdependencies between humans and the rest of the land communities have played an essential role in whether humans have flourished or not. And you could see that looking both ecologically at a time or historically through time. And so that's my take on my elaboration on the first Leopoldian stewardship precept. This is why we should see that the land is our community. Okay. Second question, why should actions benefit? It's one thing to say they're part of our community, but why should actions benefit not just humans, but also these other members of the community? And why should they benefit the community as a whole? So this really kind of gets what I see as the heart of the argument for the land ethic. So in that quotation I mentioned earlier, I highlighted that piece where Leopold implies that interdependence is the basis for our obligations to human communities and in human communities. In other words, because we are parts of interdependent communities, we accept obligations and rules of conduct that limit our freedom of action. And so he says, look, we just take it for granted that we have these obligations over and above self-interest when we support things like the betterment of roads or schools or churches or baseball teams, right? We see that these are beneficial to the community. We see that we have these community-wide obligations. Okay. But then, again, what we learned from the first precept, it's not just humans that we are interdependent with, right? This is just thinking about humans, but it's not just humans who we're interdependent with. So what does that mean? Well, let me just put a bunch of these pieces all together. Given interdependence between humans, we accept limitation on our actions, these rules of conduct that benefit and protect individual humans and human communities, and our ethical theories capture these rules of conduct. However, as we saw with the first precept, history and ecology show we're not just interdependent with other humans, we're also interdependent with other species and with abiotic components like soil and water, and together we form land communities. So, if we're going to be consistent, and philosophers tell us we should be consistent, right? We want a consistent ethics. If we're going to be consistent, that means we need to expand our ethics to include the land. It means we also have to accept rules of conduct that benefit parts of the land community, right? That benefit our fellow members as well as the community as a whole. So it's consistency that's telling us why we need to expand our ethics, right? Because we are interdependent with the land community just as we are interdependent with our human communities. So that's Leopoldian stewardship number 2, that our actions should not just benefit humans, as Pinchot said, but also land community members and the land community as a whole. Okay, third precept raises the question, why should actions seek to protect and promote long-term health of the community, right? So if we have obligations to the community, maybe, but why long-term health? Well, when Leopold talks about shifting from what benefits humans to including what benefits the land community, he does retain Pinchot's idea of the long run. So I did want to highlight that. That comes along. So he retains that from Pinchot. But what benefits the land community in the long run? So Leopold has this interesting passage in Zant County Almanac where he says, the most important characteristic of an organism is the capacity for internal self-renewal known as health. That's a strong statement. Most important characteristic of an organism is capacity for internal self-renewal known as health. And then there are 2 organisms whose processes of self-renewal have been subjected to human interference and control. One of these is man himself through medicine and public health. The other is land. Here he refers to land as an organism, which is interesting. But, and then through agriculture and conservation, right, we've affected the land. So whether we're benefiting humans or land, either way, we should try to preserve their health, he's telling us. But how do we do that, right? And what is land health? How do we preserve the health of the land? And well, what is this thing, the land's capacity for internal self-renewal? So to elaborate on what land health is, Leopold argued that land is a fountain of energy flowing through a circuit of soils, plants, and animals. And the food chains, as we talked about before, like acorn to quail to owl, those food chains conduct energy upward from the soil to plants and then to animals, and death and decay return that energy back down to the soil. When we've got a healthy or stable land community, the circuit's not closed. I mean, you're going to have some energy dissipated in decay, some added. Whoa, I hit a bad button. All right, we'll just ignore that. Some energy is added by absorption from the air, some is stored in soils, peats, and along with forests, but it's a sustained circuit, like a slowly augmented revolving fund of life, he says. So And then he says that this continued energy circulation, right? What makes it continue? What makes it sustained? It depends on the characteristic numbers as well as the characteristic kinds and functions, the interactions of the component species. And then here he kind of speculates, and he admits he's speculating a little bit, that the longer these chains of interactions, right, like the longer the food chains, the less time nutrients are down in the soil. And he was so aware of erosion. He was so worried about soil and water erosion. So the less time nutrients are in the soil, more time they're bound up in organisms, less opportunity for erosion. And so that sustains the cycling. That sustains the ability of the community to persist over time, to be able to support a diversity of life over time. Okay. So, but he didn't just see land health, he saw land sickness as well. And early on in his career as a forester, especially he saw forests here in Arizona, which were looking pretty good at the time. Then he went to New Mexico and go, oh, not looking good there. And so he started to see what he would later identify as symptoms of land sickness. So abnormal erosion, abnormal floods, decline of crop yields, decline of ecological carrying capacity. He would see some species erupting, right? Their numbers would just explode. Other species would just disappear, right? Go extinct, or at least go extinct in that area. And then he's like, well, what's going on here? What's causing these? And he found that a difficult question to try to answer. But he hypothesizes. First, he's pretty sure loss of soil fertility. A lot of the things he saw early on in his career really brought home soil fertility matters. And when you lose it, that's going to that's going to make the land sick more than anything else. Here, he's like, the evidence is a little more circumstantial here, but loss of diversity of flora and fauna, that also seems to be connected with the health of the land. Okay, so, and then he says, well, but maybe we can restore land health sometimes. And he's, again, kind of speculates, maybe even the sickest, what he saw, the sickest of land, like the Dust Bowl, right? Where at that point, nothing is growing there. Maybe it's possible that we could restore those wasting soils by planting things, by planting prairie flowers. And in his own land, he and his wife Estella and their whole family planted year after year. They planted pines and they planted other species. And a lot of them died and they had to be replanted, but they kept going. And if you go there now, there's a flourishing forest. So he thought, okay, we can act to restore land health. Again, there are some contemporary examples of restoration. So one, and there is a little controversy about this one, I admit it, but it is at least thought by many that restoring wolves controlled elk populations, and that allowed many other interdependent species to flourish. Why? Because the elk were eating everything, and that, again, had negative downstream effects on other species. But when you brought the wolves back in, that controlled the elk populations, and all these other species were able to flourish. So with that restoration, the land can better sustain life over time. Land health was restored. On the other hand, a different kind of example, not as positive, is overfishing. In particular, in the Northwest Atlantic, many species are interdependent with cod. And so the loss of cod there meant the loss of these, again, the loss of these other species as well, with the loss of the matter-energy flow necessary for health. Here, restoration efforts have been sluggish. Areas not supporting life. Land health has been elusive. So this tells us that restoration of land health is not guaranteed, right? So we need to be cautious from the get-go. We can't just say, oh, well, we'll restore that, it'll be better, right? It's not always possible to restore. So all of this is meant to bring us to the third stewardship precept, which is to seek to protect and promote the long-term health of the land community. All right, fourth precept, we're getting there, 4 out of 5. The fourth one raised the question of why we should shift from purely economic considerations to ethical and aesthetic ones. So here again, we see Leopold shifting a bit away from Pinchot, but not shifting away entirely, right? He shifts away from purely economic, but it doesn't fully shift away from economic, because it, of course, goes without saying that economic feasibility limits the tether of what can or cannot be done for land. It always has, and it always will. The fallacy the economic determinists have tied around our collective neck, and which we now need to cast off, is the belief that economics determines all land use. This is simply not true. An innumerable host of actions and attitudes, comprising perhaps the bulk of all land relations, is determined by the landowner's the land user's tastes and predilections, rather than by his purse. The bulk of all land relations hinges on investments of time, forethought, skill, and faith, rather than on investments of cash. As a land user thinketh, so is he. And I just have to say, kind of an aside, I keep really appreciating those last two sentences there, right? This is telling us, like, let's think a little more creatively about our land use, right? We can do this, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So, but the point here is that we have a fair bit of flexibility in our land use. And, you know, in general, economics isn't the sole determinant of what we do. And so if there's this flexibility, if it's not all about economics, we can act to do what's right. And, you know, how do we do that? Well, that's what the first three precepts were about, right? That was telling us why we should change our values, right? So we can incorporate that change in values in our thinking as well. Okay. And then he takes this even a step further, this argument about pure economics. He says, it really isn't workable in the long run. He says, one basic weakness in a conservation system based wholly on economic motives is that most members of the land community have no economic value. Wildflowers and songbirds are examples. Of the 22,000 higher plants and animals native to Wisconsin, it's doubtful whether more than 5% can be sold, fed, eaten, or otherwise put to economic use. So, in other words, a purely economic stewardship, like Penn shows, is consistent with extinction of species that are deemed to lack economic value. And then, but Leopold says, but wait a second, these species are, as far as we know, essential to the land community's functioning. The purely economic approach assumes falsely, I think, that the economic parts of the biotic clock will function without the uneconomic parts. So, in other words, I hear him saying that pure economics will ultimately be self-defeating. It's actually not long-run conservation, even of the economic parts. Why? Because of the interdependence of all of the parts, economic and uneconomic. So now, in fact, Germany tried this experiment, and this very much, I think, influenced Leopold's thinking. When he visited Germany in 1935, he found this heavily managed forest. And at first, they were really excited to plant lots of spruce and pine, and those were what was economically valuable for them. And that out-yielded the naturally occurring, less intensively managed forest of mixed conifers and hardwoods. But by the second and third rotations, those superior yields didn't recur. And they, in fact, began to decline. They had also, again, part of this sort of management, they had eradicated large predators to try to promote the deer for hunting. Unfortunately, and this happened in the US as well as Germany, this led to severe damage to the forest from deer foraging, but yet it wasn't actually good for the deer either. They had nutritional deficiencies. There were also negative effects on the soil and on native birds, right? So this trying to preserve the economics only had some negative consequences. And so they had assumed that they could retain only the economically valuable trees and deer. That was not the case. And all their best attempts at management only made things worse, right? Like they tried feeding the deer, that did not help. So this brings us to the fourth stewardship we've just covered, which is that we should consider ethics and aesthetics of the land community in addition to economics, right? Which we still will have to think about. Okay, we're at the last one. And that's how do we resolve land use conflicts? So let me just elaborate this problem a bit more, what it means for land use conflicts in this context. So because Pinchot only had to adjudicate human land use conflicts. But Leopold was kind of an ethical pluralist, so it gets more complicated. Leopold, again, thought that there was value to the whole land community, that we had obligations to the whole land community. He also thought that individual humans and non-humans, that they had value, and we had obligations to them as well. So that's a lot of things that have value, a lot of kinds of obligations. So can we translate this kind of pluralism into environmental policy? Well, the challenge is that these different values and obligations can come into conflict, right? What's good for individuals and land communities might not be the same thing. And one common example is an invasive species that's threatening the existence of other species and the health of the land community more generally, right? So you're gonna have to make some hard choices here between these different entities of value, but how do you make them? And so here, when I wanted to think about that, how to resolve these conflicts, I thought, well, how did Leopold do it? What did he do in the course of his lifetime? So this is just a couple of examples. So he had actually crafted policy in a lot of different areas: agriculture, forestry, game management, but just to pick two of them. In the early 1930s, he was an advisor to the Coon Valley Erosion Project in Wisconsin. It had been selected by a new federal bureau to be the first watershed in which to demonstrate the value of soil conservation measures, with the goal to show how farmers could plan farming operations to include soil conservation for long-term productivity. There's that long-term again. He also served on the Wisconsin Conservation Commission from 1943 to 1948. There he worked on a whole variety of issues, everything from warden pensions and ice fishing seasons to tractor purchases and state park concessions. But in particular, this was one year after year, he recommended policies to reduce size of the deer herd. You probably see that as a theme coming up again and again. Reduce size of the deer herd for forest health. All right, so with respect to the first of those two projects, the erosion project, Leopold described what he called the principle of integration of land use. And that sounds so much like something a philosopher would say. I have to say, I didn't make that up. He called it the principle of integration of land uses, a reorganized system of land use in which not only soil conservation and agriculture, but also forestry, game, fish, fur, flood control, scenery, songbirds, or any other pertinent interest were to be duly integrated, right? That's a lot of different interests, including any other pertinent interests, right? A lot of interests to be integrated. Concerning the second of those two policy efforts, the Wisconsin deer herd, Leopold wrote that this commission was created and was given regulatory powers for the express purpose of insulating it to some degree from the domination of fluctuating public opinion. It was hoped that such a commission might take the long view, there it is again, rather than the short view of conservation problems. Okay, let's put these ideas together. What does that mean? That means we need to take an even more pluralistic approach, right? That incorporate not just individuals and wholes, right? But all these different types of values, including anthropocentric ones, right? Forestry, game, fish, fur, flood control. But what's special here is that there has to be this common commitment to land health. Right, that's the essential piece. That's the new piece. Okay, so how do we do that, right? When again, the variety of interests and values are going to conflict a lot of the time. I said sometimes, but a lot of the time. And with so many types of interests, it's almost guaranteed. So how do we integrate them? How do we get advocates for different types of interests and values to cooperate rather than compete? The obvious answer is to seek out win-win solutions. And I call that the obvious answer, but so often we don't do it. So often we just take what's cheapest, what's easiest, what's the first solution to come to mind. And we don't take that step back and think, is there another way? Is there a better way that could satisfy more of these interests? So this is the reminder to take that step back, right? To thinketh, as Leopold said, and to see if there's other ways of proceeding. Unfortunately, sometimes no win-win is available. We can't come up with one. So then in the book, I talk about this in more detail, but the idea of a respectful, inclusive, science-based process that seeks to harmonize the different interests and values, that recognizes that failure will occur, that educates the public. And those, I think, I derive those out of things that Leopold himself did during the course of his life. But again, I'll just keep emphasizing this. The main thing that this process has to have is this common purpose, this long-term health of the land, right? Where no matter what else you're doing, everyone has to have that commitment. Okay, so here's just a couple of applications of this principle of integration of land uses. I'm not claiming that these folks kind of consciously did this with Leopold in mind, but I think they manifest the type of principle of integration of land use that I've talked about. So one is the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project that involved bringing together people who really you thought like would not be able to come to agreement. On the one hand, you have anti-logging environmental activists, and on the other hand, you have these Forest Service employees who are used to using timber sales to finance infrastructure for firefighting, right? They couldn't seem to be more imposed. Yet through the efforts of one woman in particular working really hard, she was able to find common ground, and the common ground did have to do with this common interest in the health of the forest, right, which they both shared. Another example that I think shows that you can serve like a wide variety of interests in one area. This is Yolo Bypass near where I live in California. So this Yolo Bypass was constructed to, originally flood control, but it does a lot more. Seasonal agriculture with crops like sugar beets, rice, safflower, and corn. There are wetlands there that provide habitat for many species of birds and mammals, including threatened ones. There's aquatic habitat for fish species, again, including native and threatened and endangered. And also recreation. You can go out there, and people love this. Bird watching, hiking, tours, all kinds of fun stuff. So that's a really wide variety of values that they were able to satisfy with this one project. Okay, Leopoldian stewardship precept 5, we should follow the principle of integration of land uses. This is the kind of thing that we should do. Okay, so let me just give a few more reflections on the term stewardship, right? I give you all 5 precepts. So now this is me just kind of taking a step back and thinking, okay, where are we now? We've got these 5 precepts. So here I just want to remind you that Leopold doesn't actually, as far as I know, describe his land ethic in terms of that word stewardship. He does use words like obligation, responsibility, conscience, which might seem to be in the ballpark, but he doesn't use that specific word. And so this is me saying that that's my own interpretation of what might be considered Leopoldian stewardship, and that's to contrast with Pinchot's. Now, steward, as I start out by saying, does have some other connotations. Like one is conqueror. And that's the one that makes me the most nervous, because Leopold said that the conqueror role is eventually self-defeating. We're not smart enough to play the conqueror role, and that we should, this is, sort of famously said, we should understand ourselves as plain members and citizens of the land community instead. So I think whatever stewardship might mean for Leopold, it can't be conqueror. It's not that. Maybe, stewardship also seems to apply like an entity who's responsible for managing or looking after something. That's kind of a better fit. I'm still a little uneasy. This is, I guess, like I said, this is sort of my exploration. I'm interested to see what you all think of this. Still a little uneasy with the term, because it seems to put us in charge. And I don't think Leopold thought we were really smart enough or in a position to be in charge. So here's maybe a suggestion for how, sort of how we might think about Leopoldian stewardship on a meta level. And here's just to remind us that in most cases, the vast majority of cases, each of the other members of the land community, they're contributing to the health of the whole, right? They're doing their part. And so given our interdependence with these other members and the limitations of our knowledge, we ought to do what we can. We ought to do our part, but we have to proceed with it cautiously, because we can screw it up, and we have so many times screwed it up. So A steward in this sense, and maybe I'm just recreating the word, I don't know, but would be not so much taking charge as doing its part. It's a distinctive part, right? We have distinctive capabilities as humans, but it's a sort of a reminder that, you know, even though we have a potential to do great good, we also have this potential to do great harm, and too often we have fulfilled that potential to do great harm. Okay. It's 5 of. Should I do my 2 more slides or should I? Yeah, keep going? Okay. All right. So this is just me just kind of pushing a little bit more on the boundaries of Leopoldian stewardship, just to elaborate a little bit more. And I picked what I take to be kind of a provocative example. So we'll see what you think of it. So this is from Woodside in Northern California. And this is was just in the paper this past year. So the town wanted to use part of a 22-acre parcel of land for 200 units of affordable housing. Sound good, right? State pushed back, and this is actually a flip from how it usually works. In this case, the state pushed back and said, no, the site was found to have 2 rare species of wildflower, including one that is on the California Native Plant Society's list of endangered rarities in Northern California. And also the site was noted as a wildflower reservation on our record maps. And due to the ecological value this site presents, we are still evaluating the decertification, right, to allow the housing to go through. So how should we think about a case like this, right? For many, the answer just might seem obvious. Like, why would you even ask that? Affordable housing's in short supply everywhere, especially in California. So you build the housing. Doesn't even seem like a question, right? And if you could see that headline, right, it's pitched as housing versus flowers. Who chooses flowers when you could have housing, right? So it almost seems like why even ask that question? And I believe that a Pinchot type stewardship would agree with that answer. Why? Because I think the greatest good for the greatest number of people in the long run would seem to be to build the housing, especially given the probably low monetary value of these rare flowers. But I think this is the part I really want us to stand back and think about. If we always do this, if we always make that choice, then what we're doing is committing to the long-run extinction of many species, right? Not just these 2 flowers, but in every single case, if we make that same decision over and over and over again, the rare species always lose out to the human interests. And then we get widespread extinction of species. So what is different about a Leopoldian stewardship perspective? Well, again, it's not just humans who are considered, but all members of the land community, as well as the health of the community as a whole. So again, we try for that principle of integration of land uses. We try to foster cooperation rather than competition between the different interests and values, to try, to the extent possible, to find a harmonious balance between them that also preserves the health of the land. So now I'm not going to tell you what the right thing is to do here. I'm not claiming it's easy either. But what I'm saying is you need to get these folks into a room, get them to respect each other's interests, and get them to talk it out, right? And ideally, you do that before everything starts going to the lawyers, right? You have the conversation first and try to get as many people on board as you can. So that's what I think, you know, don't pitch this as flowers versus people or flowers versus howling. Pitch this as a multitude of interests that we need to get together to work together. Okay, so I'm still a little bit unsure of the stewardship framing. I'm kind of working up to it, kind of warming up to it, but I hope to have at least shown that shifting our understanding of stewardship to a Leopold one is a workable approach. And I think it does a better job of protecting our environment than the Western approaches that we've used so far. So again, just brief summary of what the 5 precepts are. 1 is to recognize plants, animals, soils, and waters as fellow community members, not as resources. 2nd precept is to recognize that our actions should not benefit only humans, but also community members and the land community as a whole. In other words, 3, their health, the health of the land. 4, that we should broaden beyond economic consideration. And 5, 5th precept is that we should resolve conflicts through the principle of integration of land uses. With the ongoing climate crisis, rapid extinction of species, and loss of habitat, we need more than ever to understand we cannot just focus on ourselves without recognizing all the biotic and abiotic entities that we are interdependent with. And that is it. Thank you. And I will take questions. And there's a microphone.
For anyone in the room that has questions, please raise your hand.
Great. Thanks, Roberta. Nice talk. I haven't read Leopold in a bit, but can you say a bit more about the abiotic factors as a part of this interdependence argument? And especially in terms of there are words in there like obligations, actions that should benefit a community, and the land as an organism. Can you kind of open those things up a bit more in terms of what he's thinking about, what you're thinking about?
Yeah, I can try. So actually for Ishkabibble, and you know what I mean when I say that, I did a talk on Leopold's views on soil, and I said I kind of dug in, a little bit to how he came, because I was really struck by what a strong statement that was, right? That he was so sure that soil fertility was essential for land health. Why did he think that? And what I learned was that, those early years as a forester, he just saw the importance of soil everywhere, right? That he saw that, people were trying to farm and people were trying to graze animals, and it was just causing these massive erosion problems. And they couldn't do what they wanted to do. And it was affecting game too, which of course, as a hunter, Leopold was always paying attention. Well, what's happening with the game? They were declining as well. So everything was declining because of the way people were mistreating the soil. So kind of early on, he realized soil is everything, right? That nothing else happens unless you treat the soil well. So, and then, I think his thinking kind of, as he started thinking more of it like ecological community, started thinking of those terms, he thought, what does this mean? This means that soil is part of the community too, right? So does that answer what you were asking, or? I didn't hear what you said. I couldn't hear it.
There's sort of this next step then where there's an analogy between the soil sort of being this living organism in kind of a Clementian sense, actually, that sort of argument. Does that continue to work as far as the whole land ethic argument?
So I think every time Leopold used the word organism in unusual ways, you kind of see he's always feeling a little bit uneasy about it. Like I think he kind of sees the case for doing it and why it makes sense. But, I think his scientist hat was a little worried about it. That being said, I think there probably is a good case for seeing soil as an organism. But I don't think anything he says rests on that, necessarily. I think what matters is that soil is an essential part of the land community, maybe the most essential member of the land community, and we are interdependent with it, and it's providing us many, many services directly and indirectly. And so we have obligations to it because of that. And I think that's the essential piece, whether we see it as an organism or not. I think is an interesting question, right? Of course, I'm a philosopher. I would think that's interesting, but I don't think anything rests on it per se. So, yeah.
Question from online that I'll read very quickly. This person asks, I have a question about the 5th precept and integrated land use. I'm struggling to reconcile agriculture as a designated land use to be integrated alongside other land uses, and particularly alongside other land uses that are not organized foremost around human interests. Agriculture seems to fundamentally involve clearing the land and imposing a new ecology onto it. That seems basically at odds with integrated land use, as well as with some of the ideas of land health. Maybe this is a genuine conflict within the account, but perhaps I'm missing some way of reconciling agriculture with the Leopoldian land ethic. I would appreciate your perspective.
Sure, yeah. I'm going to kind of come at that from two different directions. I mean, one is how much time Leopold spent thinking about agriculture and agricultural practices. He was very concerned about the way that people were farming, and he didn't think they were farming in a way that made their farm sustainable or that made the land community sustainable more generally. So he offered kind of a variety of suggestions for how people could farm better in such a way that was healthier for the land community, right? So, and a lot of it, the things we talk about today, right? Like having hedgerows that support, you know, other species being in your farm, right? Instead of trying to just clear cut everything. Or some were just things like, you know, maybe you shouldn't be planting on that hillside, right? Because that's just going to cause erosion, right? So he was thinking in terms of how to do forestry better, how to grazing better, agriculture better, all these things better in a way that preserved land health. And then, but I think I also heard in that question, I mean, I think there is this question of, well, who's speaking for these other entities, right? You can have the farmer in the room, you can have the forester in the room. I think you do need to have, you know, and this is the scientifically informed part, you need to have people who sort of know, well, what are the species in the area? What are their requirements? What do they need? What sustains them? I think that needs to be part of the conversation too. So yeah, you can't just have the ag interests and the forest interests, et cetera, et cetera. You have to have people representing all of the interests. And I think that's kind of a common thing that, you know, this approach would share with, you know, an animal rights approach, right? You know, we're going to have to, in some cases, speak for these other entities that cannot speak for themselves. So I hope that answers the question that was asked.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I like how you kind of stuck on the semantic issue of the term stewardship, because whenever you're defining your initiative, your action, it's really important to have a strong definition, an idea of what your purpose is, what your guiding principle is. So I just had a thought that when we talk about managing, it shouldn't be as like a micromanager, as like a boss. It should be as about managing our behaviors and our response, like being aware, conscientious of these relationships. That kind of management could be a different definition for stewardship.
I love that. That's great. That's fantastic. I was like, I have to remember that now. No, that's fabulous, right? Yeah, manage our own actions, right? And it can be both, right? It could be like, here's things we need to do to restore this land, but also knowing when to back off, right? Or to do less. So sometimes it'll be do this, sometimes it'll be don't do this, right? Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Really enjoyed your talk. I'd like to ask you to speculate a little bit more on precept 4 and 5 and how that might translate into, say, national environmental policy. You gave some great sort of grounded, localized examples at the end. As I was thinking, the thing that came to mind most concretely was like the habitat conservation planning process in the Endangered Species Act, right? Which says, you know, critical habitat should be based on biological considerations related to species, and not specifically says not on economic considerations, which has been spectacularly a failure, right? And so the question is, yeah, so I mean, designation of critical habitat failed so spectacularly that they came up with habitat conservation planning as an alternative sort of approach. So if on precept 4 and 5, especially since Leopold was so interested in federal public land, how does this approach, how might it translate to reforming the way that we do federal environmental policy for federal public lands?
Yeah, that's a very good question and a hard question. I mean, Endangered Species Act is interesting. I mean, I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know already, but you know, we have it, and we know that it's imperfect, and yet we have it. And having it is better than not having it. And so I think a lot of people have been really hesitant to change it. So there is that sort of that pragmatic, when you have something that's maybe limping along, right? Maybe we would be better off with a community preserving communities rather than preserving particular species, right? I know a lot of people think that. I certainly think that, but I'm, especially right now, but for many years, right, people have just not wanted to mess with it. So I think some cases will be like that. I mean, once you enter the political realm, there's going to be, there's going to be compromises that you have to make, right? But I think, bottom level, and I know I keep saying this, what Leopold is introducing is, let's think about land health. Let's put that into the conversation, right? Because so often it isn't in the conversation. I mean, and even, I would say, even among environmentalists, people who call themselves environmentalists, sometimes that's not in the conversation, right? We think about how are we going to address climate change, and we think about how are we going to bring the carbon down. And, those are good conversations to have. But we also still have to think about how this is affecting, the communities where we're putting solar panels or whatever, God knows what we're doing to the atmosphere, right? So I think it's the main thing is to get that be part of the conversation. But then, yeah, in practice, compromises will need to be made. Does that help? Yeah.
So you said you were uncomfortable with like the word stewardship, or
Little bit.
it's like a managerial role. Do you think
Yeah.
it's because it implies like a hierarchy that we are, in a sense, above, and that we're kind of pulling on the strings?
Yes.
So it's like humans have a very unique way of thinking about things. Like we're able to consider things. This is something that like a duck probably wouldn't do. Thinking about the interconnections of the environment. Do you think that if you would reframe humans, because we often say that we're not a part of nature, but we did arise from nature, like we arose as organisms, that we're like the thinking side of these communities. That's our role.
Yeah, I do, and I think that's the part that's the part I'm comfortable with. That we are, well, other species think too, but we're the ones who think a lot, and so yeah, that's our role. But I think again, history has shown that we've not always deployed those thoughts to good ends. So that's the part where we need to be more humble about what we know, what we think we know, what, even the well-meaning restoration attempts, some of them have gone very badly, right? We thought, oh, we'll introduce this species to control this other species. And it's gone badly. So that's why I think like manager seems really strong, and maybe it outpaces our knowledge and our ability to think. But what can we contribute? Yes, we can contribute as thinkers, and that's our capability, right? Whereas, some others are photosynthesizers or predators or, other contributions. So yeah, I think I'm fine with it as long as we remember that plain member and citizen part, right? We're doing our part, and that's our part, but we don't want to try to do too much.
Time for about 2 to 3 more questions. I think I saw one over here first, and then over here. Okay. Okay.
Since you are a philosopher, I have a philosophical question. How was he influenced by other philosophers? Was he influenced by Rousseau and Romantic movement? How was his interaction with indigenous people and their relationship with land and environment? How was he influenced overall? I'm sure, some of them were influenced by John Locke in terms of privatization and, utilitarian value of land, right? So.
Yeah. So this is the part where I say I am a philosopher and not a historian. And so I do defer to people like Kurt Miney or to Dan Schilling, who have, looked at his influences more than I have. I mean, I can tell you that, he talked to a lot of people. He certainly, I think it was Julianne Warren who called him like the great synthesizer or something. He's really good at synthesizing ideas. He's another historian I would defer to. Really good at synthesizing ideas from a lot of different places and a lot of different people. But I am not the best person to spell out what all of those are. Yeah, so I will defer. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about the fourth precept that you were talking about, and sorry if I just misunderstood it, but it's about Leopold saying we should value land beyond its economics, and you mentioned aesthetics as one of those things. Does he touch at all about things that we might be able to, how we might be able to value land beyond instrumental things? Because aesthetics is still the way, like the value that we get from it. So does he have any perspective on that, or like what would your take be on that?
Yeah, good. Yeah, I do think he thinks that, yeah, I agree with you that aesthetic value is kind of an instrumental one, right? It's one that we have. I would almost say it's an anthropocentric value, right? Because we value it. But I think the ethical piece of it is where it's not anthropocentric, right? Where he comes to see that we ought to value the land community in and of itself, for itself, not just for what it can provide for us, but as an entity in its own right. So I think they're both there side by side, the instrumental and the intrinsic, and the anthropocentric and the non-anthropocentric. I think all those elements are there kind of together in his view.
We have one more question from online.
Okay, this question says, can humans be wronged by non-human entities equally interdependent in the ecological community? Or maybe a better and similar question is how the concept of wrongdoing works itself out in the picture. Thank you so much for the great talk.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to ask you to read that again, or maybe if I just read it myself.
Sorry.
We'll bring it to you, Roberta.
Okay. This one?
Mm-hmm.
Can humans be wronged by non-human entities equally interdependent in the ecological community? I see. Or maybe a better and simpler question is how the concept of wrongdoing works itself out in the picture. Thank you so much for the great talk. That's what I had to read that again. So yeah, if I understand the question, I think, can we be wronged by other members of the community? We can certainly be hurt by other members of the community as individuals, and maybe even as a community, right? Again, if you think of invasive species, right, can threaten communities and could, threaten some of our communities. So I think we can be hurt. I don't know, wronged implies, kind of an ethical intent. I think I might kind of pull back from that a little bit. I don't think I would ascribe ethical intent to most actions. I mean, a gorilla can certainly be a real jerk to another gorilla, but in general, I think, I wouldn't presuppose that. So I would say, yes, we can be hurt. Yes, we might want to take actions to defend ourselves or our community, but I wouldn't necessarily put ethical intent or ethical ability on most of the other entities of the land community. So.
I wanted to just comment on your word about humble, and to just point out it took Leopold a long time to get there.
Yeah.
He comes out here in 1909 as a 22-year-old kid, pretty full of himself.
Yep.
And most people don't know he wrote the first master plan for the Grand Canyon. And in that plan, the words he uses to describe indigenous people makes you wince. It's how do we get rid of them? How do we get them off this land? But I think and he shoots the wolf in 1909, and he doesn't write about it until 1944. It takes him 35 years to figure out what happened on that hillside up there by Alpine, Arizona. And it is these influences. It's the indigenous people. It's the land. He'd never been west. He grows up back east. He'd never been here. And you mentioned the Germany thing. I think that is so important.
Yes.
Because think about what's going on in Germany in 1935. And he's a pretty naive guy about politics when he gets there, and he's not when he leaves. He has that great, he sits in a Berlin hotel room and he writes that great thing. He says, the way we treat the land is the way we treat anything. Because he realizes what's happening is the regimentation of the trees is the same thing that's going on in German society.
Yeah, thank you for all that. And I agree with everything you said. And I think that's one of the things I find impressive about Leopold. Look, we all screw up. We all maybe have some beliefs that we ought not to have, but the ability to recognize that one's early beliefs were mistaken, problematic, the ability to change over time in light of new things that you learn or people you talk to or seeing things in a new way. I think that's so important, right? So it's not that he was some great saint who had everything right from the beginning. No, he was someone who saw how badly he screwed up, how badly humans were screwing up, or Western humans were screwing up, and sought to do better, and sought to try to convince other people to do better. So yeah, that's one of the things that really draws me to his thinking. Yes. For Humanities Week, yes, he was a widely read scholar, yeah, and drew on that, and you could see it in his writing. You could see those influences there, yeah.
I was just going to tack on really quick to your question that you asked earlier about national and federal level policy. And something I'll say is what you said about getting the conversation started. And something that we've seen is starting from the ground up, where we have communities and people get together and start the conversation and get the conversation going, advocate for it. Conservation and recreation were not Forest Service policies to begin with, and they are now.
That's a great answer too. I steal that also. So yeah, I love the idea, right? We start these conversations locally, right? We get people on board locally, we get it working locally, and we can start to bring it to bigger regions and bigger regions still. Yeah, that's great. I love that. You have one more question?
Got even one more.
And I got the mic, so yay. Well, actually, I was just, your uncomfort with stewardship, and I wondered if we took that to caregiver. And now that's kind of a gendered term, but it's a good, in one sense, it's a good term, the caregiving. And then it made me think, in your book, you talk about vulnerability and, how one way of thinking about interdependence is, we're vulnerable, nature is vulnerable to us, but we're also vulnerable to nature. And so, but thinking about kind of being caregivers, and it's not like caregivers, we don't really think of caregivers, they're not know-it-alls, but they do stand in a certain kind of relationship to the object. And so anyway, because I'm, I've always been, the idea of stewardship sometimes does sort of have this, kind of up on high hierarchical.
Okay, so it's not just me then that has
No,
that worry. Okay.
I'm with you, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But anyway, I thought that, I don't know, that it just made me think that another way of thinking about it might be caregiver.
Caregiver, yeah. Yeah, I'll have to think about that. I'm worried too, like, as you said at the outset, though, that might also have too much of a sense of I'm here taking care of you. I actually think I really like, Robin Kimmerer's reciprocity. And I think that's a way of talking about it that has us giving back. So everyone read Braiding Sweetgrass if you haven't read it. It's a great book. And she does give a couple of Leopold mentions in there too, which I really like. And I think that goes really nicely with interdependence, reciprocity, right? So if I had to pick, I would pick that, I think, yeah. But I just, like I said, Professor DeRoche said, talk about stewardship. I'm like, okay, let's see what happens if I do that. Where does that go? So this is what happened. You all can tell me later if we think continue with this or don't continue with it. So, thanks. Vertical. And get a chance to Thank you all for your great questions. I really appreciate that.
And thank you to those joining us online today. Thank you, Roberta.
Oh, thanks.